In the high wilderness of Oregon, the world had ended. The bootleg creek fire had consumed the forest, the animals, and the sky. It left behind nothing but silence and ashes. It was the perfect place for a man who felt like he was made of ashes himself. Marcus Thorne wasn't running to something. He was running from everything. From the empty house in Portland, from the sympathetic whispers of neighbors, from the image that haunted his sleep, the blinding flash of headlights on a rain-slicked highway. The cabin belonged to his uncle, a relic from a different time. It was cold, empty. A fortress of solitude to match the one he'd built inside his own mind. His wife, Clara, his 5-year-old daughter, Lily. The fire inside his memory was so much hotter than the one that had destroyed this forest. Grief is a heavy blanket. It smothers everything. Hope, appetite, sleep. Marcus had been a celebrated artist, known for capturing life. Now, he couldn't even stand the sight of his own charcoal. Everything was a reminder of what he had lost. He came here to disappear, to let the silence and the gray just swallow him whole. The forest was a graveyard. There were no birds, no squirrels, no life. Hoos, the wind whispering through the bones of the trees. He walked 4 miles, not paying attention to where he was going. He just needed the physical burn in his legs to distract from the emotional one in his chest. Then, something. A sound. It was so small, it thought he'd imagined Italiano. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a it was a chirp, like a strange, desperate bird. He followed the sound to a fallen giant. The inside was a dark pit of wet ash. He expected a bird, maybe a field mouse. He turned on his phone's flashlight, and the light hit 2 tiny, reflective eyes. It was impossible. A flicker of life in a world of death. He didn't know what it was. A kitten, a raccoon, it didn't matter. It was alive, and he was not. He had no idea how it survived. Maybe the hollow log had shielded it from the worst of the heat. Maybe its mother had hidden it there before. He stopped himself from finishing that thought. He looked at the trembling creature in his palm, and for the first time in 6 months, he felt something other than grief. He felt responsible. He named it Ash. It seemed fitting, a life born from the cinders. The next 48 hours were a war against death. The creature, Ash, was fading. He was too cold, too weak. Marcus became a different man. The soldier in him, the man who had a mission, took over. He set his phone alarm for every 90 minutes. Feed, clean, warm. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He sat, vigil by the wood stove, terrified the tiny heartbeat would stop if he looked away. He was fighting for this one, small life, with a desperation he wished he'd had for his own. He was pouring all the grief, all the anger, all the desperate, useless love he had left into this one tiny, soot-covered creature. And then the fever broke. On the 3rd day, Marcus woke to a sound he hadn't heard in so long. A sound of contentment. Ash was alive. And in the process of saving this tiny, impossible creature, Marcus Torney had accidentally saved himself. He didn't know it yet. But the life he'd saved wasn't a kitten. He hadn't rescued a pet. He had invited a predator, a secret, a guardian. The forest had given him a gift, and soon the world would come to try and take it back. The first snows of winter melted, giving way to a spring that fought to reclaim the burned land. And as the forest healed, so did Marcus. The cabin, once a tomb, was now a studio. The man who had forgotten how to live now had a strict routine. The silence that had almost driven him mad was now filled. He was talking again. At first, just whispers to the creature, then full-on conversations. He talked about his art, about the weather. He told Ash about Clara and Lily. He was unpacking his grief, one memory at a time, all to an audience of one who never judged. He just listened. And he was drawing again. Frantically, Ash had become his muse. He studied every line, every muscle, every whisker. He was an artist obsessed with his subject. But the more he studied, the more he realized the subject didn't make any sense. The suspicions started small. Kitten's play, Ash trained. He didn't chase. He stalked. His focus was absolute, unblinking, and he wasn't growing like a kitten. He was expanding. At 8 weeks old, his paws were the size of a silver dollar. At 12 weeks, they were wider than a man's palm. They were comical, gigantic, like a child wearing his father's snowshoes. Marcus sketched them, puzzled. No cat had paws like these. Then there was the sound. Marcus had tried to get him to meow, but the sound never came. When Ash wanted food, he would let out that strange, high-pitched chirp. But when he was watching something outside, like the deer that passed by the cabin, that sound came out, a vibration that felt ancient, primal. It made the hair on Marcus's arms stand up. And finally, the ears. He'd ignored them at first, but now he couldn't see anything else. These weren't a cat's ears. They were antennae, tipped with ink-black tufts that twisted and turned, capturing sounds Marcus couldn't hear. He was sketching them one afternoon, lost in the detail, when a shadow fell across his drawing table. Ben Carter, owner of the Pioneer Feed and Seed, he was the closest thing to a neighbor Marcus had, even if he was 10 miles down the mountain. Ben was the first human to visit the cabin since the accident. Ben was a man who had lived in these mountains his entire life. He'd seen everything: black bears, cougars, bobcats. He was kind, but he missed nothing. And he was the last person Marcus wanted to see, what was currently walking out the screen door. Ben's voice was low and deadly serious. He wasn't just curious, it was afraid. Lynx. The word echoed in his head. It was impossible. A ghost. But he had to know. He'd been afraid to Google it. Afraid to confirm the secret he already knew deep down. But Ben's visit had changed that. This wasn't a secret. It was a time bomb. Doubt had become dread. He loved this creature. It had saved him. But what was it? He was watching Ash move through the new spring grass when a jackrabbit bolted from the brush. It was a display of speed and power that defied physics, a silent, gray blur. It wasn't the clumsy play of a kitten. It was the lethal, perfected efficiency of an apex predator. Ben was wrong. This wasn't a ghost. It was a monster, and it was the only thing in the world he had left to love. He had to know the truth. He had to see Dr. Roy. The sound was the sound of nature. Efficient, brutal, and honest. But in the cabin, it was a declaration. The gentle, purring creature Marcus had slept with on his chest was a killer, and the love he felt was now twisted with a cold, sharp blade of fear. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't hide from the tufted ears, the giant paws, or the evidence now cooling on his porch. Lynx. The word Ben had used. A ghost. He had to know. He had to know what, exactly. He had been sharing his home and his heart with. The 20-mile drive to town felt like crossing a hostile border. Every car that passed, every hiker he saw on the road, felt like an accusation. The creature in the kennel was no longer his companion. He was evidence. He was a fugitive. He parked in the back. He couldn't walk through the front door. Not with this. He had called ahead, told Dr. Roy it was an emergency. He hadn't lied. The sound of that lock was the sound of a door closing on the life Marcus had built for the last 6 months. He was in trouble. Deep trouble. This wasn't an exam. It was a containment procedure. Marcus did as he was told. Ash padded out of the kennel, nervous but magnificent. Under the fluorescent lights, his silver-black fur was stunning. He looked unreal. Dr. Roy was a professional. She was calm, but her hands were trembling. She didn't use the pole. Instead, she simply watched. She watched Ash move. She watched him turn his head, those tufted ears rotating like radar dishes. She watched him raise one of his massive paws. The words hit him. Prison. Fines. But the doctor wasn't finished. The legal threat wasn't the worst part. This was the trap. The impossible, perfect trap. To keep Ash was to risk prison. To be discovered was to sentence Ash to death. The creature that had pulled him from the ashes was now a living death row inmate, and Marcus was his executioner. The room was silent for a long time, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Marcus's world collapsing. Dr. Eva Roy was a healer, but she was also an officer of the law. She was holding an impossible choice in her hands, a tiny flicker of hope. But she held up one hand. The drive home was a funeral procession. The truth was a cage, far stronger than the metal one in his truck. He had 1 week to save Ash's life by finding a way to give him up forever. The next 48 hours were a blur of digital desperation. Marcus had his mission. 1 week, he entered a world he never knew existed, the world of exotic animal sanctuaries, and he learned very quickly it was a world with no room. Dr. Roy's solution was a fantasy. The legal way was a fortress with no doors. The system that was supposed to protect animals was the very thing that was going to get Ash killed. The clock was ticking. Day 3 was gone. If the legal way was a locked door, he had to try the natural way. It was the one option he hadn't been able to face, the one Dr. Roy had warned him against. If Ash was going to die anyway, maybe, just maybe, he could learn to be wild. He drove to the most remote place he knew, a place where the ghosts still lived, a place Ash could disappear. He was yelling at the animal, but he was screaming at himself. This was the right thing to do. The only thing, but Ash just sat. He didn't know the script. He didn't understand that this was where he was supposed to run free. He just knew that his family was yelling at him, and it was scary. And that's when it happened. The wild that Marcus was counting on showed up. It was a bobcat, smaller than Ash, but it was a real predator. It saw a competitor, an invader, and it was ready to defend its territory. In that one, single, heartbreaking moment, Marcus saw the truth. Ash wasn't a wild animal. He was a pet. He didn't know how to fight. He didn't know how to be a lynx. Marcus hadn't raised him. He had broken him. He had stolen his wildness and left him trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. Had failed. There was no sanctuary. There was no wild. There was only the cabin, and the clock was still ticking. While Marcus was failing to save his secret, the world was closing in. Day 6. The deadline was the dawn. He hadn't found a solution. He hadn't found a miracle. He had failed. He was just waiting. Waiting for the phone to ring. Waiting for the sound of a truck on the road. Waiting for the world to come and take his family away. He'd been so worried about the law, he'd forgotten about the hunters. A light, small, infrared, blinking once every 30 seconds. A trail camera pointed, not at the woods, but directly at his cabin, directly at his porch. He was surrounded. They weren't hunting a ghost in the woods. They knew. They were hunting Ash. They were hunting him. The trap had sprung. The hunters knew they hadn't just seen Ash, they had proof. The blinking red light wasn't just a camera. It was a death warrant. He ran. His only thought, destroy the evidence. Destroy the cameras. He was a man undone, running on pure, uncut panic. He scrambled up the bank, found the first camera, and tore it from the tree, smashing it against a rock. But as he searched for the next camera, the world changed. The wind, which had been a whisper, became a scream. A wall of white, a freak blizzard, was descending from the mountain peak. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 5 minutes. He was too late. He had failed, and he had brought the cold. Wet mud back into the cabin, just as the hunters pulled up to his door. They didn't wait for the storm to hit. They had come the moment they saw the pictures. They had come for the monster. But Ash had decided he was done hiding. He emerged from the bedroom, not as the gentle creature Marcus had raised, but as the protector he was born to be. And in that moment, the broken man, the artist, the widower, disappeared. And the man who had something left to fight for had finally shown up. This was it. The end. But the hunters and the protector had all forgotten about the one enemy they all shared. The storm, the old wood, the impossible weight of the snow. The cabin was collapsing. It was happening in a fraction of a second. Hank, the hunter, the man who had come to kill, was frozen. He looked up at his own death, falling from the sky. He had no time to move. He was going to be crushed. He didn't run to safety. He didn't attack the man. He saw only a member of his pack in mortal danger. He had saved the hunter, but in saving him, he had sacrificed himself. The monster had become a martyr. The cabin was a tomb of snow and broken wood. The hunter was alive, and the guardian was trapped. In that one, frozen, impossible second, Hank's world. His rules, his entire understanding of monster, had been shattered. The shock broke. Marcus scrambled toward the beam, trying to push it. It was solid oak. It weighed half a ton. It wouldn't budge. Dale was paralyzed by fear. But Hank, the man who had come to kill, moved. They were enemies. They were strangers. And Were, for this 1 second, a team united to save the creature they had all come to condemn. The storm was now inside. They were trapped. All of them. The hunter, the artist, and the wounded guardian. The world had turned upside down. The man who had come to take Ash's life was now the one helping to save it. The sun rose on day 7. The deadline, and with the sun came the sound of a truck. Dr. Roy had kept her promise. She hadn't found a solution. So she had made the call. The law was here. It was the testimony from the most unlikely witness in the world. The hunter was defending the hunt. Hank and Dally owned the surrounding 2,000 acres. The fire had taken everything from Marcus. It left him with ashes. But from those ashes came a life, a creature that was too wild to be a pet and too tame to be a ghost. He wasn't a monster, or a cat, or a secret. He was a guardian, a forbidden guardian who had taught a broken man that even in a life burned to the ground, something, anything, was worth saving.